Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Go to Market and Sales Mentors APAC. I'm delighted today to welcome Daniel West. Daniel is CEO of Prospection, former Chief Sales Officer with MYOB, and has held Vice President positions at Oracle, Salesforce, Infoblox, and Informatica, among others. Daniel, thanks for coming on for a chat.
Hi, John Joe. Great to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
So I want to kick off with this term, go to market. Now, your experience has been managing strategy, operations, sales, of course, and success for a number of years. But this term, go to market, has perhaps come into prominence in more recent years, but it's been around for some time, particularly considering your experience. What are your thoughts on the reason for this becoming more prominent, and what changes have you seen in terms of how businesses go to market in recent years?
Sure. So go-to-market certainly as a term has been around for quite a while, certainly since probably pretty early in my career. I think the difference between then and now is in the past, go-to-market referred to a process or a set of activities that a company did to create awareness and ultimately sell to their customers, right? Go into market. I've actually had debates with people in the past about whether it should be called go to market or go to customer. But I think the big change that's happened, particularly over the last couple of years, is that there is now a senior executive or sometimes even a C-suite level role that is responsible, might not be called chief go-to-market officer, though I'm sure there's probably some that exist, but that they're responsible for all of the functions that contribute to the company going to market. So everything from marketing, sales, pre-sales, customer success, channel, service, support, and so on. And so I think that's probably been a big shift that I've seen certainly over the last few years and experienced myself, to be honest.
And such was the reason I was so really excited to bring you on and talk about this, because you're somebody that's perhaps had that position whilst it's in APAC, at least. That position doesn't really exist so much as yet, in my experience anyway, somebody to have go-to-market leadership and have all those broad business units underneath it. What's your thoughts on, firstly, who should own that organization and how a hierarchy might look potentially?
I think it depends on the size of company. So, for example, right now in my current role as CEO of Prospection, I think you could say that I'm responsible for all of those go-to-market functions ultimately, but we're a 75-person organization. When I was, my previous role in MYOB as Chief Sales and Support Officer, I would say that I also had responsibility for all of those market-facing functions. So that was marketing, sales, pre-sales, channels, customer success, support, services, and then the operations and enablement capabilities that went along with those functions. That was a very different size organization. That was an 1,100-person team. So I think it, varies a little bit. That was a C-level role reporting directly into the CEO. So I think it probably varies a little bit based on the size of the business.
And what's the biggest challenge in the go-to-market process for SaaS businesses right now?
Well, I think there's a lot of challenges just in general right now, especially with the shift to market expectations around profitability. I would say that keeping your existing customers is probably one of the highest priorities for most organizations, as well as continuing to acquire new customers. I think though the one of the challenges in this which has probably driven this shift that we're talking about here, is that in the past, where you had these more traditional organizations, certainly like the ones that I worked with early in my career, you would have different executives that were focused on these functional silos. So you would have a chief marketing officer, a chief, sales officer, You'd have, heads of customer success, heads of consulting or support and services. Sometimes there were parts of those that were grouped together. Often those roles all reported directly up to the CEO. And I think the challenge with that structure is that with all the goodwill in the world, you ultimately create silos in the organization, which does really two things. One, it creates gaps in your visibility as a business to the effectiveness of that revenue cycle or the customer life cycle. And then the other thing that I've also seen firsthand is that it really impacts the ability or the amount of friction, I suppose, involved in reallocation of resources. So when you're ultimately responsible for all of those functions, directly, it's not easy, but it's easier to make decisions about reallocating resources from one part of your organization to another. When those organizations are all owned by different executives who have their own agendas, their own careers, their own performance metrics, and so on, it's much more difficult unless you are the CEO and you enforce those things. It's much more difficult to make those trade-offs a reality. And so I think that creates, that's created the environment for this broader go-to-market role to exist. But then going back to your question about the challenges that SaaS businesses are seeing that I think relates to this issue is this idea of revenue leakage. So there's been a couple of companies out there in the market recently talking about this idea of these revenue leaks that occur at different points in the revenue life cycle. So it might be because you're experiencing leakage because your prospects aren't converting to opportunities at the most optimal rate, or you might be experiencing revenue leakage because the opportunities that you're working on that are supposedly highly qualified and not closing as well as they could be, or you might be not experiencing the sort of net revenue that you should be because your customer success processes aren't working effectively. And so all those leakage points in the funnel all contribute ultimately to revenue loss.
And you mentioned silos and expectations of profit. The performance metrics are very clear for the sales organization, for instance, right? Revenue quota attainment, you hit it or you haven't, whereas the other silos, perhaps the performance measured isn't so clear. If we look at the sales organization, we look at quota attainment for direct selling teams, somewhere between 30 to 40% at the moment. Where is that problem within the go-to-market organization coming from, and what do you see as perhaps a remedy for that?
Well, that is a very big question. Look, I mean, the 30-40% attainment is clearly not where anyone wants to be, and as someone who has carried a bag for a long part of my career, that's not great. But I think there's it's a very multifaceted problem, right? Because it all starts ultimately with, are the expectations of the organization correct, right? So and what I mean by that is, have you really worked out not only what your total addressable market is, but what your service addressable market is? Because if there is a mismatch between those expectations and the reality, then and you end up hiring a lot of salespeople to go out and drive try and extract business out of a market that isn't as big or doesn't exist, then you're going to have a challenge. Similarly, if you've not provided your sales team with if the product doesn't have a compelling enough value proposition in the market, and it doesn't, or even worse, it doesn't solve a business problem that is compelling enough and important enough to the customer, then again, that's going to be a contributor to that 30 to 40% quota attainment. And so, as I said, I think there's a lot of threads you could pick at in that question.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe focusing on the sales team, if we talk about that silo again, you previously talked about what businesses can do right now that's really important is to seek clarity. So why would customers change to use our product, and why should they pick us? It sounds pretty simple, but many businesses are just throwing more salespeople at the problem. We need more pipeline. Can you talk about implementing this formula and what it means for the sales team and the sales org when it's done well?
Sure. So I'll give you an example. So I joined Prospection about 18 months ago. So our business has been around for about a decade, founded by two brilliant data scientists and an equally brilliant medical doctor. They have solved a plethora of problems for pharma customers across various phases of the pharma life cycle. But when I joined, I joined at a time when the company had made a decision to move to a SaaS, to a SaaS business model, which means you have to drive repeatability, you have to drive scale, because that's ultimately how you build a market. And so, where I spent a lot of time very early in my tenure is really working with the founders, but working with the team more broadly to try and create clarity around what was the problem, what were the consistent threads and themes of the problems we had solved over the previous decade. Who were the customers we had solved them for, and what were like the types of roles that these people sat in, and what were the material business benefits that they had seen as a result of those problems being addressed. And ultimately, what we came up with is this idea of what we call care and share leak. So similar, interestingly, very similar to the revenue leak problem we were talking about before. But in the pharma context, what care and share leak means is identifying opportunities to improve both patient outcomes and market share or revenue performance through a better understanding of what we call patient-centric indicators. And so we have built a SaaS data analytics platform that provides what we call patient-centric intelligence to commercial leaders within pharma that essentially allow them to understand key questions about the markets they serve, identify potential areas of unmet patient need, and also drive far more precise go-to-market execution. So, for example, making sure that they're allocating the resources in their go-to-market organizations to the right opportunities in the market. So that's been, and we've seen some great success, over the last 12 months. We've as an example, we've doubled our business in Japan. Now we've gone from 0 to our first 3 customers in the US, and continued to expand within what was already a fairly well penetrated market here in Australia. And so that just bringing that clarity and creating that repeatability has had a lot of very real, relatively short-term business benefits for us as a business.
Got it. And how important is that filtering down to the frontline sales team, and how do you get that idea of clarity into the way that they do business and they talk to customers?
Yeah, so we built a sales playbook. So I engaged with a firm who I have worked with for many years, who kind of essentially helps to gather and then synthesize a lot of the best practices that already exist within an organization and put them into a playbook, and then tie that with a simplify. We had a company had a sales process previously, but it was probably a little bit more complicated than it needed to be for the size of organization we were at the time. And so we really simplified that down into a 4-step sales process with very clear customer exit criteria for each stage, that were very well connected to this overall, value proposition and messaging framework that I was just describing. Put that in place. We had a sales boot camp in about this time last year, so end of August last year, and that was where we rolled that out to the teams. And then since then, our sales leaders in the organization have been continuing to drive, focus and accountability around the execution of that sales process, as well as, the delivery of that message in the market.
Got it. And could you talk about how this sales playbook and the sales force, in fact, Daniel, is perhaps a little bit unique to perhaps the ones you've led in the past?
Sure. So one of the unique characteristics, I think, of Prospection is it is a very vertically specific or vertically oriented offering. So the problem we solve is not specific just to pharma. So we have the capability to solve problems for pharma, for payers, so health insurers or governments, and then for providers, so specialists predominantly. Where the focus has been, so that's kind of the ultimate market that we serve. Where the focus has been and is for this stage of the company's evolution is really on that pharma space. And so as a customer-facing person in the team, you need to have a very high-level knowledge, not just about selling, but you have to have a lot of clinical expertise. You have to we tend to sell into very specialty disease areas, so oncology, hematology, immunology. And in order to have a conversation with, commercial leaders within pharma that spend their lives in those areas, you have to be able to speak that language. So we have pharmacologists, for example, on our team. We have people that have PhDs in various areas that go out and work with our customers. So having that clinical expertise has been, proven to be very, very important. You also need to have a fair amount of analytics knowledge and data savviness, I would say, because the problems that we're solving or the solution we're delivering is ultimately insights that are based on data and based on very sophisticated methods of analyzing data, much of which is done in the platform itself, but you still have to be able to talk about it. And then lastly, you need to understand the customer, and that's pretty typical for any sales role, but you need to understand pharma as a business and how they operate. And so what I found, when I joined Prospection, it's not like you can go out and hire a really good database, salesperson or an applications salesperson and bring them into the business. And so what we ended up doing was we took a team of highly skilled, more technical people who have those strong analytics capabilities and have those strong clinical knowledge, and we taught them how to sell and how to interact with customers. And so far that has been, reasonably successful.
Yeah. Has there been much of a difference in ramp time for instance, a typical seller learning product versus specialist learning sales fundamentals?
No, actually, I don't think so. I think it's, as I said, we're still relatively early in the journey, right? So we only rolled this out. We only started this or launched this transformation, I suppose, in August of last year. But so far, the results, as I said, are proving to be quite positive.
And this is a really specific case, of course, but I think at least anecdotally, the go-to-market industry as a whole is pivoting more towards a vertical approach. The mandate that I'm given from customers to go and find account executives, for instance, is people that are really good at solving problems, really good at qualifying, and really understand the customer. Again, it seems straightforward, but that seems to be what's needed in this climate. What are the best attributes of a salesperson, particularly now, would you say, Daniel?
I think it depends on. Obviously on what they're selling and whom they're selling it to. But in general, I would say resilience is always a is always a good core skill set for anyone in the sales profession. I would say curiosity. So curiosity coupled with effective communication skills. So being intentionally curious and being able to ask good open-ended questions, because that's ultimately how you do effective discovery and qualification. So I think that's a key skill. Being able to influence and drive change. I mean, ultimately, especially today, salespeople in any kind of enterprise B2B, context, the person that typically, you can't talk to one person, right? Any buying decision is made by, I think it's, 9 or 12 people or something ridiculous now. But you have to, and as a salesperson, even if you're a large account salesperson, you're probably not going to always be able to speak to all of the stakeholders directly who are involved in that buying decision. And a lot of the time, there might be a lot of people who can say yes, and one person says no, and your deal gets stalled or delayed or goes away altogether. And so as a salesperson, you need to be able to enable your champion. And that means you need to be a storyteller. You need to be able to craft and articulate a story about the problem that they're trying to solve, the value to them of solving that problem, why they should, to your point earlier, right? Why they should change now on your timeline, ideally. And then ultimately and lastly, why your solution is the one that they should move forward with, because it represents the highest benefit for the least amount of risk. And if you're able to craft and then articulate that story and then enable your champion or champions to go and tell that story for you within their organization, then that's going to give you the best possible coverage and ultimately, help you get that consensus across that stakeholder community that you need to move forward. And then I think, another key behavioral characteristic, I would say, I don't know if it's a skill, but is having a process mindset. Salespeople need to be very successful. Salespeople, I think, need to be very process driven, and be able to manage a process and more importantly, I think, navigate a process on the customer side, their buying process, their procurement process, how they make decisions, and be able to adapt and change what they're doing in response to the customer's process.
For sure. I heard it described just today, actually, as enterprise selling as really careful project management at the highest level, which I think is to what you're talking about. Process and implementation, you've obviously built a career in designing and implementing process. I want to go into your point around the characteristics of hires that you might look for. So if we're thinking about resilience, communication, curiosity, how do you go about, and it might be you perhaps not frontline interviewing right now, but if you think about your previous roles, how do you go about evaluating for those characteristics when you are hiring?
So a lot of it, so number one is past demonstrable past experience is always a good one. Not the only one, but it's a good one. So being able to not only being able to show on your resume what you've done, but be able to talk in detail about why you did it that way, how you did it, and what the outcomes were. Because quite often, people can be tangentially involved in something, but the ones who actually did it and also who learnt something from what they did, when they can get to that level of detail, and they can have a dialogue with you about, don't mean the intricacies, but the key things they did in the process, then you've got a pretty high level of confidence that they were actually the ones, architecting it and or doing it themselves.
Got it. And you have to be a skilled interviewer to really dig into those specific areas and understand which part of those processes they owned as well, right?
Yeah, so that's one piece. I do, I do tend to. I've hired a lot of people. A lot more have worked out well than not. So I think this is valid, but I do tend to use my intuition quite a bit, and it's not always a hard science because quite often you're looking for characteristics somebody has, and particularly if somebody is early in their career, they may not have that detailed experience that I just spoke about of having done it. But if you can see something in them in terms of the core characteristics and attributes they have as a person, and in whatever professional experience they have had, then sometimes that's enough to take a bet on somebody.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that because I had John McMahon saying the same thing just a week ago on a similar podcast, and basically saying you should look for the characteristics because they're the things that won't change regardless of the other things. So I am really interested in that the number of execs I talk to that are looking to hire on characteristics first. It's obviously situational, right? You need some skills and experience for this particular opportunity, but yeah, characteristics do seem to be the key thing that predicts success. But interesting to also hear that some of that's gut feel, even for somebody like yourself that's so process orientated. And that's been the same throughout your hiring. It's always been a similar gut feel.
Yeah, I would say it's one of the elements. It's not the only one, but it's one of the rubrics in my head that I
Sure. So in terms of career, I wanted to take a bit of a step towards the modern CRO. We touched on this in terms of the person who might own go-to-market, and you're somebody that's had all these different responsibilities in the past, which would now take the role of a go-to-market leader. Can you talk about your appointment as Chief Sales Officer and now CEO? And is that a trajectory that was something you thought of that has always perhaps been the way that your career was leaning, or is it something that's been a different track?
Yeah, so I think I've always had an aspiration to become a COO, which is what that similar type of role would have been called back 10, 15 years ago, or a CEO. Though I would say that I don't think that, so I've always had that aspiration. I don't think that my path to the CEO position that I'm enjoying now is typical. So I started my career in direct sales in real estate, commercial real estate. Then moved into direct sales in software. Moved into leading a channels and alliances as function. Then had an opportunity to that was for a Australian subsidiary of a US based software company. Then I had the opportunity to take what was supposed to be a 2-year foreign assignment in the US, where I was building and leading a global partner enablement capability, which was fundamentally about creating leverage for the organization. So essentially training and enabling, resellers and the large SIs on how to go out and sell and deliver services around, offerings. That role ultimately expanded to when I was leading all of sales and technical enablement, as well as I took on responsibility for a P&L, which at the time was education services, because there was a natural intersection between the content creation and training delivery associated with the product that we were doing for our internal stakeholders, as well as what we needed to do to train customers, and so that broadened out, and then from that kind of point forward, I just progressively took on roles where I had more and more senior positions, but those senior positions I had also more and more functions. And so ultimately, took on sales operations, plus sales enablement, plus marketing, plus strategy and operations, plus renewals, and then all the way through to the chief sales and support officer role at MYB that I was describing earlier. And so it's really been, for me, my career has really been about going horizontally, always within that go-to-market domain, but it's really been about going horizontally as opposed to going deep within a particular one of those functional areas, which I think, frankly, has probably set me up quite well for this for a CEO role, because as a CEO, you have to be a generalist and have an understanding across all the various functions that a company requires to operate effectively, but you don't necessarily have to get down into the detail in every single one of them.
For sure. And the traditional CRO route that is purely coming from direct sales, I think it's becoming more apparent that you're going to have to be very, very, very good to go from direct sales purely without any exposure to other areas. We are seeing GTM leaders coming from marketing now, RevOps. What are your thoughts on skills are most important for CROs or go-to-market leaders now, and how might somebody shape their career to try and get the exposure that you've had?
Yeah, I think I will address that, but before I do, I think the RevOps piece is really quite interesting. So I think for me, where there was a real inflection point was when I took on sales operations, which is what we called it at the time, in addition to the sales enablement piece. And I think the reason why it was important was because ultimately organizations are striving to extract the maximum amount of yield out of their investments in go-to-market, right? And that means driving as much, or optimizing go-to-market productivity as much as you possibly can across all of those elements of go-to-market. And when I look at enablement as a function, enablement is all about effectiveness. So it's, are you doing the right things in whatever role you're in, whether it's sales or pre-sales or customer success or what have you? Are you doing the right things, and are you doing them well? In sales operations, it's all about efficiency. So it's like, are you doing the right things as quickly and as cheaply as you can, because you're being supported with you're following the right process, you're using the right tools, and you have the right disciplines. And then obviously the other part of sales ops or RevOps is really measuring those outputs so an organization can have visibility and transparency to how their business is, moving forward. And do they have healthy pipeline? Are they converting at the right rate? Et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that is a key, I would say that is a key piece for any aspiring go-to-market leader, is putting yourself in a position where you can attain experience working in, or ideally ultimately leading those two parts of a business in particular, which is the enablement, and then enablement plus sales operations or revenue operations together, because that was a key, I think, inflection point for me was being responsible for that productivity equation.
And also the customer acquisition cost, I suspect as well, that'd be something that'd be a little bit more front and center in how you go and build your sales team if you're responsible for it, right?
Which in today's world, where everything is about, it's no longer about growth at all costs, it's about profitable growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think it's, of course, not mandatory, but do you think it would be useful for that person to have had some direct sales experience, at least somewhere along the way?
Absolutely. Yes. I think a big part of what the the ingredients, I suppose, that I think have helped me along the way is having empathy for all of the functional leaders and roles that have ultimately reported up to me. So while I may not, so for example, I've never been a CMO, but I have worked in marketing. I have been a direct sales leader. I have been a leader of a channel sales function. And so it's very important to have that, I think, to have had a taste of as many of those go-to-market functions as you can in some capacity. Because even if you don't become a deep expert or in any one of them, ideally you want to be probably pretty much of an expert in one or two. But it also allows you to go broad, but still have an understanding of each of them and what's important to them. Just going back to your question around the skills or the traits for a go-to-market leader, I think that there's so one is that experience. Yeah. So to answer your earlier question, I think that there's a set of skills and traits that a go-to-market leader needs to have to be successful. The first is the set of experiences that we talked about. I think another really important trait is the ability to establish a vision and a strategy and create a plan which can be executed and ultimately operationalized. In my own personal experience, I think every go-to-market leadership role that I have held has had a very large degree of transformation associated with it as an outcome that I needed to drive. And so being able to set that vision, establish the milestones of the journey along the way, the metrics you need to know whether you hit those milestones, and then bring the rest of the team with you along that journey is very important. I think having a really good understanding of the fundamentals is important. And by fundamentals, I mean things as basic as why it's important to have a call meeting planner, right? A sales call planner. Just like really basic things like that. A lot of the basics get lost a lot of the time. And I think having that discipline and process mindset, which ultimately allows you to systematize the processes and the fundamentals that you put in place, all drives good revenue outcomes. And then I think, this has always been true, but I think particularly true right now, is the willingness to learn and adapt and embrace new things. AI obviously has a lot to offer from a sales perspective, I think, over the next few years. So it'll be interesting to see how that all pans out. So those are kind of the traits. And then in terms of skill sets, leadership, communication, being able to influence, operating at what I call different altitudes. So being just as comfortable having a strategic conversation with the board, but also being able to dive down and work up to your elbows on a problem with someone in a functional part of the business. You have to be data oriented and analytical, not necessarily a data analyst, but you have to be able to understand data, extract insights from data, and then use those insights to make better and more effective decisions, or at least more effective arguments. I will balance that by saying you also have to be intuitive, right? You've got to have enough experience to be able to trust your gut on whether it's hiring someone or whether it's making a quicker decision. I've also seen the opposite, where you have very analytical executives who never make decisions because they never have enough data to tell them definitively one way or the other, and that's a dangerous place to be. I think as a CEO or as a senior executive, you have to be able to synthesize. You get a lot of information, and you have to be able to synthesize. You get a lot of information from a lot of different parts of the organization, and so you have to be able to synthesize that information and be able to turn it into something tangible that you can use. And then as I said earlier, I think just having that generalist view across a lot of those different functions, but having some level of depth in a couple of them is really important as well.
We talk quite a lot on this podcast about trajectory. I'm thinking out loud as to how someone might plan that type of exposure in today's SaaS world, right? So you've obviously built a career with smaller companies, but also bigger ones, Salesforce and Oracle. Become a vice president, I imagine, did a great job, and then asked to take more responsibility, got greater exposure, and that set you up for CRO and CEO roles. If somebody perhaps is a new VP sales in a SaaS organization, Australia, likely 200 staff or less, here, you'd have thought for the most part. How would you envision that person goes and gets broader exposure if they're not working for a larger tier one? Do you think it would be useful to go work for a bigger organization? Or how do you think that you might navigate that, particularly in the Australian market, which we know is smaller than the US?
I mean, I think that, number one, you have to be open to new opportunities, right? I think everyone needs to make their own decisions about what's important to them, but I would strongly encourage anyone who wants to take has aspirations to get to that CEO or CRO kind of C-level position, to look for opportunities to go and work overseas, because the scale that you get, particularly if you're in tech, going and working in Silicon Valley was a huge learning experience for me. But if you're in tech, you learn things, you learn how to operate at scale, and you just get such a broader variety of experiences that I'm not sure are available in the Australian market. And to be fair, I've only been back here for 4 years, so I may be selling as short. But that would be one piece of advice. And I think the other piece of advice would be, if you're a VP of sales or a senior director of sales or what have you even in an Australian organization of some scale, 200 people, I think you said, be willing to maybe take a step sideways. And if you're the senior director of sales, but you're interested in ultimately growing your career, maybe consider taking a step sideways and taking on revenue operations as an example for a year or two, or take on a customer success leadership role. I think the role of customer success is going to become increasingly, I think it's already important, but I think it's going to become increasingly important as the need to retain customers and drive expansion and upsell within existing customers continues to be an imperative. That so that's a good skill set to have in addition to your kind of that direct sales skill set. So that I guess would be my other suggestion, would be willing to go sideways to build that foundation that then you can go up, right?
Yeah, and go learn from some people that are best in class within that specific area, right? So I think the perhaps the risk could be, perhaps if you're in a startup and you asked to take on these other business units as well, and the business isn't quite set up as a go-to-market organization, and all of a sudden you're drowning, and it could be quite a detrimental experience. Whereas going and learning from somebody and then coming back sideways is perhaps is the word to be used there. Great advice, Danny. Really appreciate it. So much insights from your career today. So thank you for being so kind and generous with it. I thought maybe if you could sign us out with a little bit about what Prospection's doing and where we might keep in touch with you and the business if we wanted to take a look at what you guys are doing.
So Prospection, as I mentioned, is the leader in patient-centric intelligence. So we work with commercial pharma leaders to help them identify opportunities for them to both improve patient outcomes as well as to improve their market share performance and revenue performance. We are active on LinkedIn, so you can check out our posts on LinkedIn, and I'm on LinkedIn as well, so feel free to reach out. Thank you so much, Tanjo. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks again.
Thanks very much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.